Good afternoon. On behalf of the Inter-American Development Bank, we welcome you to the series of webinars, Walking Together Toward the Future, where we explore how key aspects of development have changed over the past 15 years and what our countries will need in the coming decade. For this webinar, we will focus on the past and future of inequality in Latin America and the Caribbean. This will be a conversation between IDB President Luis Alberto Moreno, Sir Angus Deaton, Professor Emeritus at Princeton University, and IDB Vice President for Sectors and Knowledge, Ana Maria Rodriguez Ortiz. The conversation will be in English and Spanish with interpretation. Please select the language of your choice by clicking the world icon in the lower level of your screen. Before starting the conversation, we invite you to watch a selection of bank projects and initiatives of the gender and inequality sector financed by the IDB Group the past 15 years.
Bueno, muy buenas tardes y bienvenidos a todos.
Good afternoon to everyone. Welcome. Allow me to give a warm welcome to Sir Agnes Deaton and to everyone who is with us today for this webinar. When we go back to 2005, when I first came to the IDB, 40% of the population in Latin America and the Caribbean was living below the poverty line. Our countries over the last 20 years have taken great strides, which allowed for people in Latin America to enjoy better health and have more young people having access to higher education, and particularly for the income gap, contrary to a lot of the perception currently held, has drastically decreased. As a matter of fact, the percentage of those who believe to be in the middle class went up from 23 to 38%. This is why all countries in Latin America and the Caribbean have a lot to be proud of, given all of these achievements. But as we saw in the protests that broke out last year, now with the pandemic, these achievements, as we always knew, are fragile. And inequality doesn't only have to do with income. People want better insurance, better access to education, but also want better education for them and for their children. And they do not want to spend 2 hours commuting to work and to also be left out of the digital revolution. There's a great quote from Robert Kennedy which I believe wraps up and captures this reality in Latin America. And that is that even if we act to erase material poverty, there is another greater task. It is to confront the poverty of satisfaction, purpose, and dignity that afflicts us all. Now, also, we need to understand that in addition to this, the pandemic has hit us particularly hard. We are the epicenter of the pandemic currently. A lot of people cannot leave home, and it is likely that we will leave this pandemic with higher degrees of inequality than before. As a matter of fact, 50% of people in Latin America have no access to digital systems, either because there is no broadband connectivity or because the connectivity that there is unstable or because they don't have the necessary devices in order to connect, be it a computer or a device. As a matter of fact, it is 3 times more likely for someone from a low income community to have lost their job during this pandemic compared to a higher income household. We know that overcoming inequality requires a lot more than simple steps. We need to spend more and spend better, focus on people and improve infrastructure. Soon, we're going to launch a report that takes a deeper dive into inequality in our region. Today, we have our Vice President for Sectors, Ana Maria Rodriguez, who is going to talk to us about the path that we have covered so far to address inequality, which is part of the bank's DNA. And she's also going to talk to us about the road ahead. We will then have the great honor of having a conversation with Professor Agnes Deaton, who has spent his life researching inequality, health, and poverty. And so I now turn the floor to Ana Maria. Thank you very much, President Moreno. This is a key part of development in Latin America and the Caribbean, and I am very pleased to be able to be part of this conversation and this meeting. I'm going to start with a very basic thought, and that is that society feels cohesive when individuals feel that they're part of a group, when there is a sense of belonging, and also when there are opportunities to be part of a shared goal. But it is very difficult for a society with high degrees of inequality to feel cohesive, especially when that inequality is seen as a lack of opportunities and equal opportunities, especially when they affect social mobility. Despite progress, Latin America is the region with the highest degrees of inequality in the world. The top 10% earns 22 times more than the bottom 10%. In other middle income regions, the gap between the rich and the poor is less than half. People who live in Latin America and the Caribbean are fully aware of this inequality, and they see it as a lack of fair shot, equal opportunities, which is very clear. For example, almost 90% of people living in Latin America and the Caribbean believe that the distribution of income is unfair. And 40% of those surveyed believe that their children have no opportunities to grow and learn every day. These perceptions, ironically, are coming after 2 decades of social progress in the region, with huge drops in poverty and inequality. As the president said, the percentage of people in the middle class went from 23 to 38%, and the poverty rate went down from 42 to 23%. And so, exactly where does this paradox come from? Well, this is because redistribution took place within middle class and the lower class, and it happened with 90% of those who are below that middle class threshold. And the top 1% has consistently held 20% of total wealth, which is a percentage that is much higher than in other countries. And so, given these conditions, in 2019, social protests broke out in many parts of the region. And particularly, inequality was at the heart of public debate and these protests. This public debate goes beyond just income because inequality in the region is manifest in a number of different areas. And I'll mention just a few. Healthcare is one. Despite progress over the last few decades, mortality in infants is 50% higher for lower income families compared to higher income families. Or let's say education. A child from a low income family who reaches secondary schooling reaches that level of schooling with a year and a half behind of what they have learned. In the region, there are very visible differences with some neighborhoods that could be seen as neighborhoods found in Paris, when at the same time, other parts of similar neighborhoods can be compared to some of the poorest regions in the world. And these geographic inequalities become differentiated opportunities which halt social mobility. Now, talking about digital inclusion, as the president said in the beginning, this is the principal fundamental part of the issues. And this is what we saw during the pandemic was heightened with a large degree of people who have no access to the internet. Middle and lower income people have less access to financial services, and a very small degree of people have access to formal lending. General healthcare and other social safety net issues are not as accessible to all, which increases vulnerabilities. And we know that the disadvantaged communities are affected even more now, given the pandemic and climate change and natural disasters. For example, with Hurricane Mitch, it devastated Honduras and everyone lost. But those with lower income saw 5 times more losses. And of course, finally, you need to talk about inequality among peers affecting women and in the indigenous communities and Black communities. For example, for every $100 earned by a man in Latin America and the Caribbean, a woman only earns $57. And that's in spite of the fact that they work twice as much because they have to come home and work at home as well. And for all of these reasons, over the last 15 years, the bank's agenda has been one that focuses still on fighting poverty, but also addresses equality and inclusion. Let me just share a few examples. The IDB has given great support to coverage for education and healthcare through conditional cash transfers. These have been key aspects of addressing poverty and inequality. And just as an example, Brazil and the Dominican Republic have shown that 40% of the drop in inequality is thanks to non labor related income, which are linked to CCTs. These programs started in Mexico and Brazil, but today they are virtually found in all countries in the region. On a different front, the IDB has also looked at gender inequality and racial inequalities as a key elements that should be included in each and every operation we run. We have also supported countries in helping the poorest who are living in the surroundings of cities and bringing them closer to more employment opportunities through physical infrastructure development and improved transportation systems. We, as a bank, have decided to work on improving not only access to things, but also the quality of infrastructure and water and sanitation and others. We have also worked on digital transformation for homes, for companies, and for the government, and have focused a great deal on digital infrastructure as well as training and effective access to these services. With our reports on early education and training and others, we have provided information and promoted the debate on poverty and inequality. The pandemic has been difficult for all of our economies, and all of these lacks of opportunities that I mentioned before have been made profoundly clear. For example, it is 3 times more likely for someone in a low income household to have lost their job given the pandemic compared to someone with higher income. However, the pandemic is also showing that there is a different dimension to look at when it comes to income distribution, looking at a different kind of distribution, intergenerational distribution. When we see the most disadvantaged families and households, we see that there is increased vulnerability between generations. We have seen that a lot of the boom that came over the last couple of decades in Latin America and the Caribbean came from the commodities boom. But we know that inequality is on the rise, and it is going to be with us throughout this pandemic tunnel and once we come out of it. This is why we need to create platforms and create opportunities for a new social contract that guarantees more inclusive conditions and creates more opportunities for all. And a key tool here is fiscal policies. We need to spend more, but also spend better, as the president said in the beginning of this webinar. We can look at what the OECD is doing in terms of social policies. The fiscal spending in OECD countries is 8 times more efficient than in Latin America and the Caribbean in reducing inequalities. And I'll share a few numbers. In Latin America and the Caribbean, fiscal policies, in other words, spending, reduce inequality by 5%. That income and spending fiscal policy in OECD countries have a reduction of 38%. And so we have a very powerful tool when we look at fiscal policies. Now, this is one topic among many that we are looking at, and we are including in this publication that is going to be released very soon. Latin America and the Caribbean at a crossroads, the crisis of inequality. Now, here we wanted to talk about how urgent it is for us to not only identify, but also address inequality. And because we need to fight inequality now, there is no more time for excuses because we always come back to the same spot. It's time to move forward. President Moreno, you have the floor.
My distinct honor to welcome to this webinar Professor Angus Deaton. As all you know, he's the Nobel Prize winner in economics. He's a professor at Princeton University. But more importantly, his work has focused especially on individual actions that lead to collective outcomes. And his recent work focuses more on the impacts of physical and mental distress on the poor. So with that, I turn it over to you, Professor. I know you want to make a presentation and then we can start a conversation. And again, thank you very much for being with us.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here. And I hope you can see my presentation now. I don't have very much to say, but I thought I'd show you a few slides which illustrate some of the things I've been thinking about in recent days. And over many years, I've sort of collected quotes about inequality, and I have some here about pandemics. So here are 4 that I like. One is from Rudolf Virchow, the 19th century German physician who was a great physician, who was really the first person who discovered how cells work in the body. And he said that medical statistics will be our standard of measurement. We will weigh life and see life for life and see where the dead lie thicker among the workers or among the privileged. You can see why Virchow is seen as one of the founders and, if you like, patron saint almost of people who are interested in health inequalities. Paul Farmer, who many of your listeners will know, inequalities have powerfully sculpted not only the distribution of infectious diseases, but the course of health outcomes among the afflicted. So that's a powerful statement because it's talking not just about inequality affecting the patterns of infectious disease, but it affects their consequences too. And that's something that I think is very relevant during the COVID pandemic today. Walter Scheidel, the Austrian economic historian, classicist at Stanford, he says 4 different kinds of violent ruptures have flattened inequality: mass mobilization warfare, transformative revolution, state failure, and lethal pandemics. And he suggests in a very large book that basically these are about the only things that can really flatten inequality. But I think if you read what he's been writing in the last few months, you'll see that he does not, I think, argue that this lethal pandemic is going to flatten inequality. I mean, in fact, rather the reverse. And then finally, from a modern television personality, Anderson Cooper, a situation like this, it highlights problems that already exist in society that people haven't noticed. Suddenly you see things. It's like an X-ray machine. And I really like that analogy because things that you knew were there all the time but didn't maybe pay much attention to are brought into sharp relief in the epidemic. So if I can just expand on that, the pandemic exposes and often exaggerates long-standing inequalities between people and groups. Old inequalities become starkly visible and are salient in new ways. Inequalities in earnings, in jobs, and in education, which we already heard about in the region. inequalities between people in different countries. And I'm going to have a little bit to say about this between rich and poor countries and even between rich countries. And one of the things I've been worrying about is the pandemic may turn tolerable inequalities into intolerable inequalities. But perhaps policy can help. Or if we look at the past, I remember one of Paul Krugman's first books, I think called The Age of Diminished Expectations, asked the question, he said in 1970, if you'd seen what inequalities were like in 1990, people would have said there was a revolution. And in fact, nothing has happened. So maybe these new inequalities will still leave us, and we'll just get used to even higher levels of inequality. I hope not. So one of the things that came up in the talk, and I think is just incredibly important, not just Virchow, but more recently, people like Amartya Sen and others of us have been arguing that inequalities are not just about income, they're not just about wealth, they're about health, they're about education, they're about all the other dimensions of human well-being. And this pandemic could have almost been designed to make that even more apparent than it was before, that we've got to think about income and health together. And indeed, economies are giving up huge amounts of GDP in order to protect their health. So it's clear that there's always going to be trade-offs there. And if you're thinking about human well-being, you have to think about the two together. I have one slide about the United States, and then I'm going to go more international. And that's this slide. And this comes from the work that Ann Case and I have been doing in the United States. And this is very different from what we just heard about Latin America, where the COVID came after a period of success, a period of narrowing inequalities, a period where the people left behind were doing relatively well. In the United States, exactly the opposite is true. And what this graph shows, it's not labeled, but this is showing life expectancy at 25, age of 25. And we want to separate it up between the people who have a bachelor's degree, which is a 4-year college degree in the United States, versus those without a BA, and the whole population taken together. And so you can't do this at birth, right? Because you don't know when people are born whether they're going to have a BA or not going to have a BA. But if you start at age 25, which is what's happening here, you can look and see what the life expectancy, remaining life expectancy is. So if it's 54 years, it means someone who's 25 can expect to live to be 79. If it's 62 years, they can expect to live to be 87. So what you see here is this divergence by education, this huge health inequality, which was just a couple of years here, and at the end has gone to be 8 years, and that's over a period of about 20 years. And this is due to deaths from drug overdoses, huge drug epidemic going on, huge epidemic of people killing themselves, suicide has gone up, and it's nearly all happening in these people without a VA here. So this is, in the United States, unlike Latin America, where you have narrowing inequalities, the COVID epidemic hit us in the midst of inequalities that were already, in health in particular, becoming much worse. So let me talk just, some of this you've heard already, I'll go through this quickly. The less skilled, poorer, this is now what's happening within countries. I think it's pretty general. More deprived are suffering more in both disease and earnings. The less skilled people, the poorer people must work. They have much less opportunity for shelter, especially shelter where you can earn an income. So this widens the income gap, it widens the health gaps, and it widens the gradient of health between high and low income. So everything we wanted to stop, this epidemic has come and made it worse. Pre-existing conditions make death more likely, that should say, and I'm saying, sort of paraphrase, that the sick shall be taken away. If you're already sick, it hits you even worse, so it exaggerates ill health. Healthcare appears to really matter for this disease. I think there's been a very rapid learning profile on how to treat the disease. So lower quality healthcare to start with widens the gaps further. Segregation and living conditions and transportation has been incredibly important, because transportation is a powerful forms of transportation are powerful carriers of disease. And then perhaps the thing I'm most concerned about, which came up in the talk, was this huge concern about children and schooling and about rich and poor. And the president said that I think 50% of families in Latin America do not have internet access. And that, which, you know, we knew was an inequality, we worried about it, but we didn't think it was going to determine who got educated and who didn't get educated. It's just a huge thing that the COVID has opened up this inequality. I pulled this graph. I want to just talk finally about international inequalities, inequalities between countries. And this graph comes from the wonderful Our World in Data site at Oxford. I just pulled this down this morning. So this was updated on the 21st of July, which is today or yesterday. And this shows in logarithms of GDP per capita along the horizontal axis, and in logarithms, so it's a log-log plot. And it's showing the confirmed cumulative COVID deaths as a function of GDP. Now, we're all used to seeing graphs like this, which is GDP on one axis, health on the other axis, and a positive correlation. But when you think about this, this is not a positive correlation. This is exactly the wrong way around. And what it's saying is the high GDP countries are being hit by this more than the low GDP countries. It's exactly the opposite of what we've always been told, which is high GDP protects not just incomes, your material well-being, but it protects your health too. Well, it sure didn't protect these countries here. Here's the Latin American version of this. Let's go the right way. So this is the same graph, but I've just put North America are in red and Latin America in deep red. So you got Haiti way down here. And once again, you can see even within the region, there's a very, very strong positive correlation between the number of deaths and GDP per head. Now, what this is going to do, if it stays, and that's a big question, this epidemic is not done yet. And goodness knows what it'll look like a year from now. But if it stays, then this will be equalizing across countries, just as it's disequalizing within countries for the reasons that I've talked about. So that it brings the richer countries down and the poorer countries suffer less, both in terms of income loss and health loss. So just to summarize that, it's early days in the pandemic. The pattern may reverse over time. Rich countries have the major trading hubs, which were the early spreaders, like New York, Detroit, Los Angeles, Milan, Wuhan, are all major trading hubs. And that's where the disease started. Often with pandemics in history, the rich get them first. And then as people take evasive action, it moves towards the poor, like Boris Johnson or Bolsonaro getting it fairly early on, though Bolsonaro was sort of almost asking for it. And then it moves down to poorer people as people take evasive action. So it might well be that if you look at the graph I just showed you 5 years from now, it will have reversed. And that's much more the traditional pattern. It's also true that the slowing of globalization may compress income inequalities within countries as well as between countries, because globalization has brought great wealth, but it's also brought great inequalities. But my guess is the reduction in cross-country inequality will last, that it will not be reversed, even though much of it is not understood. Much of this rests on the question as to why have there been so few deaths in the poorest countries. And I don't think we understand that yet. So that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This is fascinating, Professor. And it leads me to something which you had this great book, and we had a chance to talk about it one time in a dinner, where you basically, your book talks about what it's called Deaths of Despair and the Future of Capitalism. And it talks a lot about what you just described in areas where, especially in the United States, where you saw that there were, in a sense, pre-existing conditions such that this phenomenon was being accelerated. Now, the traditional economist view is, okay, you put a lot of money into the problem and try to begin to solve all these challenges. We've seen huge fiscal injections in
Yep.
keeping jobs, into improving healthcare. If you had that magic wand, and when you look at everything that's being done here in the US and what you see around the world, how would you do that differently, thinking of how this begins to close these gaps of inequality?
Well, I think, I mean, what's happened in the US, I'm not sure that you can say it's happened in all the rich countries. And I think the rich countries have been very differentially successful. So the countries that closed down early were the ones that tend to do the best. That need not have been true. It might have been that the epidemic would have been different. There are several papers showing that countries with female leaders did much better than countries with male leaders. And the female leaders were more interested in shutting the country. They were more risk averse, and it really, really paid off in this case. But the US has actually been pretty good on the preserving income side. I mean, I think the US response overall has been a disaster. And, you know, we should have been now where Europe is now, which is that we're patching up. We would be sponging up small pockets here and there and not dealing with enormous outbreaks. But the cash side of this has been pretty good. And there's several scholars have looked at what's happened to the poorest households in the US over the pandemic. And at least for now, there's been a reduction in poverty because these schemes have been effective. Of course, the big question in the US is what's going to happen a week or so from now when the current unemployment benefit and cash transfers give out. So I haven't looked at it in detail in Europe, but I think the biggest problem would be here if they don't renew these grants at the end of this month. And, you know, perhaps you could talk about that a bit, but you know, perhaps in Latin America, your experience with cash transfers, you know, gives you a mechanism which enables you to deal with this situation in a way that, say, countries like India or many countries around Africa would have a much harder time doing.
Oh, and absolutely. And the case of cash transfers and the systems that have been put in place in Latin America really have been the way forward for many governments to plus up those programs and essentially create that today, what is essentially a universal basic income that's converted, and the numbers of people that have been included in those programs has significantly grown. I still remember a statistic that you gave when we were talking last, is how, you know, 50% of households in the United States had no more than, if my memory fails me, something like $500 if there were an emergency at their home and they could not deal with this emergency. Right. That, of course, as you suggest, with the huge amount of fiscal stimulus that's been put out, probably that there's, you know, that cushion is probably growing. But let me turn to something that Ana Maria mentioned, which is the general sense of vulnerability amongst emerging middle classes as we know them in Latin America, and tackling vulnerability through certainly we just talked about the social safety nets, the conditional cash transfers, that are not limited to just formal workers, but equally are building a block on the region's new social contract. And of course, the pandemic has made this even more evident. In your research, what links do you find between vulnerabilities and individual well-being?
That's an interesting question. I haven't really so much thought about it that way. I do think it's important, as I said at the beginning of my discussion, to talk about all aspects, and which Ana Maria certainly did too, which is, you know, you've got to think about education, you've got to think about health, you've got to think about safety, you've got to think about all of those things. And vulnerability comes, of course, in many, many dimensions. And I think of vulnerability as being in itself a great threat to human well-being. You know, there was, I think it was Tawny who talked about, you know, someone who's just got his face above water, but a small wave will drown the guy. You know, so the thing is, it's you may be above subsistence, but you're not very far above. And this does seem like a period in Latin America where you made so much progress, but it's really fragile. And I think Anna Maria said that, or you said that at the beginning, and that is itself a threat to well-being.
Let's talk about something that you've observed and be very critical of in a lot of your research and kind of put a big reflection on, and is, inequality in terms of income, as we see it in Latin America and as Maria presented, has really come down. That of course, we're at risk, as we said earlier, that this can change with the pandemic. But we tend to measure satisfaction in terms of GDP growth and or income distribution.
Yep.
And you've argued that there's a far more complex reality to look into. And I love for you to talk about this and to challenge us into the kinds of things that we should be seeing, because as you said at the beginning, the issue of leveling that we are facing is going to force us to look at all of these issues in a very different way, because we have the pre-existing political and social conditions there even before the pandemic, which are only going to be exacerbated going forward.
Right. Well, let me say two things. One is just to reinforce something I think the battle is now won on, which is we've got to move away from looking at income and wealth and looking at a much broader perspective. I mean, when Amartya Sen pushed that in the 70s and 80s, people were not paying as much attention, but they are now. So, and the pandemic will reinforce that. But I have, as you say, spent a lot of time thinking about inequality and why I care about inequality and what I care about and what I don't care about. And I think you said something at the beginning about fairness. And fairness, I think, in some ways is much more important than inequality. Now, you can ask people, do you think inequality is a good thing or a bad thing? And you'll get sharp divisions along political lines. People on the right think inequality is a reward for hard work. People on the left, inequality is a sign of oppression, right? But if you ask them about fairness or unfairness, 90% or 95% of people hate unfairness. And why is that? Now, cynic would say, they don't know, they don't agree what fairness is. So you just go back to the same split that you had before. But I think that's too cynical. And I think that what upsets me about inequality is what philosophers call procedural inequality. And it's connected with equality of opportunity, but it's not the same thing. It's just, does your country, does the place where you live take your views into account? Do you have a chance to affect what happens? Is your voice listened to? And if there is huge income and wealth inequality in Latin America, the problem for me is not so much the existence of that inequality, but how it comes about. So if people get rich by ripping other people off, that's a very different thing from people getting rich by inventing things or coming up with new ideas or new ways of doing things. If the same few families have run the country forever, that's unfairness. And they'll tend to get rich while they do that too. But even if they didn't get rich, it would be a real problem. So that's sort of procedural unfairness, that large classes of people feel really excluded from the democratic process or from a chance. And they feel that they're just victims or they're just animals to be farmed by the rich elite who can steal from them at will. That is a huge problem. And you can get a reduction in measured income inequality, even though that's not getting any better. And, maybe that's some of what's happened in Latin America in the last 20 years. The satisfaction thing's a little bit hard too, but, it was you who said that, not me. So I don't want to endorse that position. Yeah.
Professor, when you've talked about this in the past, and is this whole issue of universal basic income. We talked briefly about the so-called conditional cash transfers. There was already a big discussion in the world about universal basic income. In fact, I remember in Switzerland, and maybe a year ago, there was an initiative in the polls to actually have a universal basic income.
Right.
Do you see that as something that is going to be one of the ways that the world looks at dealing with inequality going forward, and that governments and societies as a whole begin to understand that probably we need some form of universal basic income to deal with this huge challenge that we have in front of us?
Well, I'm not a fan of UBI. I am a fan of conditional cash transfers, which is a different thing altogether. And I think this is something that different countries may have very different views about. I think it's a ridiculous idea in the US, to tell you the truth, because in the US, we don't have a healthcare system. We don't have an education system that's worth anything. So that, you know, if you read the best of the philosophers, I think Philip Van Parijs has written best about basic income more than anyone else on the planet. He's in favor of it. I've argued with him, so I'm not going to say anything today that he hasn't heard me say. But I think he would agree that, you know, health and education are prior to giving everyone a gift of leisure, which is effectively what a UBI does. Now, in the US, why I say it's different in different countries, the US has almost a constitutional aversion to paying people not to work. And, you know, when in the Nixon administration, this was discussed and got near, you know, in the form of the negative income tax, it foundered on exactly that. And I think it would founder on exactly that today. Even today in the pandemic, when there are no jobs because we've deliberately put the economy to sleep, or part of the economy to sleep, they don't want to pay people not to work, which in these circumstances is absurd. It's exactly what you would like to do, which is stay out of the labor market right now. So, and there may be countries in Latin America where people are much more sympathetic to this, but I would encourage you, I mean, I think much higher priorities are getting kids into school, dealing with the effects of this pandemic on poor kids' education, which is going to be a huge task for the future. Conditional cash transfers may help with that, but then that's a different purpose. It's not a universal basic income. And, you know, and also, you know, schooling and healthcare, get that to work before we start giving people grants to give them freedom to spend their time as they wish. So I'm not a great fan of it.
So there are two very big public goods in any society, which are around education and health. We see already in the United States the big debate, and it's really happening everywhere in the Americas today. The whole notion that we don't know if kids can go back to school in the remainder, let's say, of this calendar year. And until we have a vaccine, life will not be back to normal. How do you imagine changing big systems like education? And on the other hand, equally, those of health, which you have put so much of a light into, which is not only the quality of healthcare as we know it, but a sense of universal healthcare that countries can provide. And here, you know, despite all the challenges that Europe had, the reality is that they had very good sanitary systems. How do you see this changing? And what are the kinds of things in terms of policies that governments need to truly redesign and rethink about?
Well, again, I'm only on really safe ground talking about the United States, and you can make the contrast with Latin America. I'm sure the pandemic will cause a lot of experimentation in universities and schools, and we might find different ways of doing education, but we've obviously got to get the kids back into school. And the colossal, I think one of the worst parts of the handling of the virus in the United States, quite apart from the huge number of people who died unnecessarily, is that we're now facing this dilemma of sending kids back to school and facing danger or not. We should never have been in that position. The US healthcare is particularly difficult because it costs so much. And that's a peculiarly US problem. Other rich countries don't have the same problem. And it's the combination of it costing a fortune, and which is rent-seeking largely by rich people against poor people. You know plenty about that in Latin America, but not necessarily through the healthcare system. And also the fact that it's funded through employment, so it acts like a wrecking ball in the low-wage labor market. But that's a particularly US problem, and somehow we've got to get rid of that. But on the long term, I'm much more worried about the fact that our educational system is creating this divide between people who have a BA and people who don't. So you've got this educated elite and everybody else left behind. And we've got to find a richer way of producing students who have a wider range of more interesting and valued qualifications, more like what happens in much of Europe, especially Germany.
Professor, what kind of research are you doing? I know you, with Jim Clifton and Gallup, you typically do a lot of research. And during this pandemic, what questions have you started to research and what are you seeing?
Well, you know, Anne and I, Anne Case and I just published this book about deaths of despair, and we've spent a lot of time doing webinars and Zoomcasts and interviews about that. And then, of course, no one wants to read our book. What they want to do is talk about the pandemic. So we've been doing a lot of thinking about how one segues into the other sort of idea. So exactly the sort of thinking that Anna Maria was talking about and you were talking about at the beginning, which is, you know, where were we? You know, what was happening? And what does the pandemic do to that? Does it reverse it? Or in the US, does it make it much, much worse suddenly? And, you know, the analysis of deaths and despair is not quite the same as what happens in COVID, but it's pretty strongly related. One of the things I've been very excited about actually is, and I'm sure you've seen this too, that the economics profession has really, you know, got out its tools and said, we can really help here. And some of the work that's being done is just terrific, I think. They've been talking to epidemiologists. Epidemiologists don't think about behavioral responses, and economists don't know any epidemiology, and the combination of those two is very powerful. And it helps understand, I think, what's been happening. The other thing that's been terrific, and I don't know whether it's true in the region too, is we're getting data in real time that we never used to get before. And that, if that sticks, that's fantastic innovation. I mean, you saw that chart I put up from the Oxford group. That's today, you know, and that would have looked different yesterday. And the same is true for deaths in the US. And Raj Chetty and his group have got in touch with all the credit card companies. So they're getting real-time data on purchases and so on. So I think that our data systems are going to change as a result of COVID and change for the better. Otherwise, it's all prediction. Who knows?
Professor, I know we're running out of time, but I can't help but ask you, you know, humanity somehow, when it is at its worst moment, seems to be the most creative. What makes you optimistic when you, I mean, your life work has been around this issue, which is so central to the world, but clearly to Latin America, it's been, you know, I often say that the reason we've had populism from the days of Perón to Chavez was largely this inequality that created all these political cleavages that allowed for a contrast between the haves and the have-not, but not to basically address issues in a substantive and a structural way. So when you sit back and look at history and look at everything that's happening and given your work, what makes you optimistic of what you see today?
Well, you know, I'm not as optimistic perhaps as when I finished The Great Escape. You know, and, you know, when I used to talk about that book, I would say this is the best time there's ever been in history. I'm not sure I would say that 7 years later, right? On the other hand, I remain optimistic because the fundamental, to me, the fundamental reason why the world is so much better than it was 250 years ago is because of the Enlightenment in a sense. I mean, people decided they wanted to think for themselves and use the power of reason to make their lives better. And that's the most powerful force, but it doesn't mean there was steady progress. I mean, some of the worst things that have happened in human history happened in the 20th century. And, you know, it would be really stupid to think that progress is inexorable. And we seem to be going through a patch now. Let's hope it's not as bad as what happened in the 1930s. But, you know, I'm optimistic enough to think this is not the beginning of the end, but it's the beginning of another period when things are not progressing so well.
Well, this is great. This is exactly, I think, a great way to end. this is not the beginning of the end, but rather the beginning of a very different period where we have to put all our smarts, all our passion to help change it. And it's been really a privilege, Professor, to have you with us. You are always an enlightenment, and thank you for all the fantastic work you do and you continue to do.
And thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And thank you for this audience, which is one that I would usually not get to address. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good luck with handling all of this.
Thank you, and have a great afternoon. All the best.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.